So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to our fourth Data and Diversity event. We're really excited about this, as I keep saying, but thank you for taking the time to join us as we look at the legacy and visualizations of Black American civil rights activist and writer, W.E.B Du Bois. So just to get started, my name is Allen. I'll be your host today. The session will be recorded and we will share it with everyone after today's event. If you have any questions for our presenters today, please be sure to submit them using the Q&A function. So we do have the chat window open as well. That's for our, this banter that we have going on during the presentation. But any questions, for our Q&A section, please put that in the Q&A section along the bottom. So a little bit about me. I'm an adjunct faculty member at Columbia University's School of Professional Studies, where I teach storytelling with data, and I have over 20 years experience in data analysis and analytics. I binge watched Tableau videos over a weekend to get started. I'm also a Tableau social ambassador, as well as a member of Tableau's Community Equity Task Force. So at CETF, we're looking for ways to make our data community more inclusive. So having events like this has definitely been helping. We've been getting a lot of good feedback. And I'm also an advisor of our Data Equity Hub, which launched about last week, which gives a lot of information on making more racial data and stats, and also partnering with different organizations that are looking to make our community more inclusive. So today, we'll be joined by our guests, Jason Forrest and Anthony Starks. I'm going to introduce them shortly. They'll be giving separate presentations centered around Du Bois, which are going to be really exciting presentations. Jason will be exploring the data visualizations that Du Bois is known for. And Anthony, he's going to take us on this journey where he recreated all of Du Bois' visualizations, and he's going to give us tips, hopefully, where we can do it ourselves as well. So before we jump in, I want to give a little bit of background about Du Bois. Full name is William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Du Bois. He was a well-known writer, sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist. He was born February 23rd, 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He completed his graduate work at the University of Berlin and Harvard, becoming the first African-American to earn a doctorate degree. He's commonly known as W.E.B Du Bois, and he's also a data visualization pioneer. While he's known for his collection of essays like Souls of Black Folks, he's also architected the nation's most sophisticated quantitative research on race and the Black population. So this research, which is about 121 years old right now, is a data narrative of resilience and perseverance. This body of work consists of about 60 full color charts, graphs, maps, and tables that have laid the groundwork for his sociology program at Atlanta University. And this project put his program on the map. And later on, and more recently, his Department of Sociology has been recognized as the first school of American sociology. So Du Bois is a man of many firsts, and his data visualizations are no doubt groundbreaking. So we're going to head into our first presentation with Jason Forrest. He's a data visualization specialist, writer, and designer living in New York City. He's a director of interactive data visualization for McKinsey and company's COVID Response Center. In addition, he's also on the board of directors of the Data Visualization Society, as well as the editor-in-chief of their journal, Nightingale. He writes about the intersection of culture and information design, and he's currently working on a book about pictorial statistics. So we're definitely excited to have him. What you're going to see in his presentation is his passion for the subject. So without further ado, I'll let Jason take it from here.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Do this part. There we go. Thanks so much, Alan. I gotta say before I jump into this, it's such a pleasure to do this with Anthony / AJ and Alan and myself. I've had the great pleasure of being friends with these gentlemen for the last 2 or 3 years, as a result of the Data Visualization Society. So it's been a real thrill to get the opportunity to present this work by Du Bois for Tableau. So as Alan said, yes, I am in New York City. I am the director of interactives there for the COVID Response Center. You can find that pretty easily. But I want to, before I jump in here, give a plug, of course, for Nightingale, the publication of the Data Visualization Society. It's right there. We are a publication that writes about all aspects of data visualization and information design. We have about 30% of all of our contributors are first-time publishers. We pay everyone, and we pair you with an editor. So there's really very, very, very little reason why you wouldn't want to publish with us. There's a URL. So I first encountered the work of W.E.B Du Bois in a book about typography in 2018. And at the time, there was really very little research about this work. Literally, I just became obsessed with trying to learn more about it and to help to tell its story. This took the form of 6 articles that are on Medium and Nightingale. Now, you'd be shocked to hear. And what I've done is kind of extract a lot of those kind of lessons and story and narrative and context into the presentation today. When I started, I was completely unprepared for what I would eventually find and how this would really impact my practice, my practice as a data visualization specialist. So before I start, I do want to just alert everybody that the word Negro will appear frequently in the talk. It's not a word I take lightly, but it's a term that Du Bois uses throughout this phase of his career. And I think it's best to honor and contextualize his use of language. So the 1900 Paris Exposition was created to celebrate the achievements of the 19th century and sought to accelerate innovation in the next. It was designed around the Eiffel Tower, which you can see there in the center, built for the 1889 exposition, but it was 10 times larger, expanding all the way to the newly created Grand Palais in the foreground. The fair was visited by nearly 50 million people and displayed many inventions for the first time, including the Ferris wheel, the diesel engine, the escalator, and yes, believe it or not, the first talking films. 56 countries, including the US, participated, creating pavilions representing their respective cultures, but the special exhibits were located elsewhere. So the exhibit of American Negroes, which we'll be discussing today, was housed in the Palace of Social Economy, shown right here. Outraged by a series of racist human zoo exhibits at US expositions, lawyer Thomas J. Calloway sends a letter to hundreds of African-American leaders across the country that says, to the Paris Exposition, thousands upon thousands will go. A well-selected and prepared exhibit representing the Negro's development will attract attention and do a great and lasting good in convincing thinking people of the possibilities of the Negro. Thomas Calloway was a classmate of Du Bois from Fisk University, and both men were in close contact with the most recognized African-American leader at the time, Booker T. Washington. A plan was crafted along with Daniel Murray, the Assistant Librarian of Congress, and the team was awarded $15,000 from the US Congress only 4 months before the opening of the exposition. Du Bois was the obvious choice to lead the effort as the chief curator, and he began to quickly compile his work on December 28th, 1899, with his students from Atlanta University. What follows is a frenzy of activity. In just 4 months, prominent citizens, educators, and students across the country began to assemble the materials. The 5 great Negro schools of Atlanta, Fisk, Howard, Hampton, and Tuskegee universities prepare exhibits. Du Bois and his students conduct a sociological study in Georgia and began to hand draw the 60+ charts. Daniel Murray collects more than 1,000 books and pamphlets by Negro authors. War heroes are documented. Businesses, churches, and Black newspapers from across the country send in photographs of their finest and best. 400 patents by African Americans are collected. And as a subtle nod to systemic prejudice, Du Bois handwrites over 400 pages documenting the erosion of civil liberties known as the Black Codes. After working tirelessly on the exhibit for months, Du Bois writes in his diary that he was, quote, threatened with nervous prostration and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, but he arrived just in time. He quickly sets up the exhibit in time for the judging, despite missing some of the materials from the universities, but the judges still recognize the exhibit by awarding it several prizes, including an overall grand prize. and Du Bois a special gold medal. The resulting exhibition was a targeted attempt to sway the world's scientifically minded elite to acknowledge the American Negro in an attempt to influence cultural change in the United States from abroad. Pulitzer Prize winning biographer David Levering Lewis writes, quote, "In many ways, the Negro exhibit represented the last hurrah of men and women of culture and accomplishment who still aspired to full citizenship rights, regardless of color." While the judges awarded the exhibit with several prizes, as you can see here, the direct impact of the exhibit of American Negroes is hard to measure. While the African-American press reported on the exhibit with gleeful excitement, the European media only mentioned the exhibit in passing, and the white American press completely ignored it. The American public never even knew the exhibit of American Negroes even existed. Despite the work of Du Bois, Callaway, and the extended community to show off the best of what African Americans had to offer, the exhibit was met with indifference. But let's take a step back and look at William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. As Allen said, he was the first African American to receive his doctorate from Harvard. Previously, before that, Du Bois studied at Humboldt University in Berlin and traveled in Europe before ultimately landing his first academic job at the University of Philadelphia. Desperate to help the plight of the African American population, he quickly turned to the recently developing field of social science in an attempt to collect compelling evidence needed for cultural change. Du Bois was rigorous in his approach and tried to incorporate the latest scientific standards. He said, quote, "The American Negro deserves study for the great end of advancing the cause of science in general. No such opportunity to watch and measure the history and development of a great race of men ever presented itself to the scholars of a modern nation." Arriving in Philadelphia after graduating from Harvard, he created his first watershed study, The Philadelphia Negro, in 1899. Compiled nearly by himself, Du Bois personally conducted some 5,000 interviews to complete the study. Here's a spread from the book, which shows some of the data visualizations, clearly focusing on the scientific presentation of the statistical data. Du Bois was very ambitious. That same year, he outlined a 10-year study of the American Negro, seen as a continuation of the Philadelphia Negro research, and he conducted a similar study in Virginia before moving to Atlanta the same year. When Callaway suggests Du Bois becomes the curator of the exhibit for the 1900 exposition, Du Bois naturally proposes a study of the Georgia Negro. And like I said, Du Bois was very ambitious. At the time, he wrote, quote, "I wanted to set down my aim and method in some outstanding way, which would bring my work to the thinking world. The great World's Fair at Paris was being planned, and I thought I might put my findings into plans, charts, and figures so one might see what we were trying to accomplish." Du Bois recalls the creation of the exhibit in his autobiography written at the age of 90. Quote, "I got a couple of my best students and put a series of facts into charts: the size and growth of the Negro American group, its division by age and sex, its distribution, education, and occupations, its books and periodicals. We made a most interesting set of drawings, limned on pasteboard cards about a yard square and mounted on a number of movable standards. The details of finishing these 50 or more charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult with little money, limited time, and not much encouragement." The resulting exhibition was more than just a scientific report. Du Bois set out to make a targeted attempt to sway the world's elite by upending the stereotypes and presenting a modern, successful, and educated people. He set out to do this by crafting a structured statistical argument of the quantitative facts. On the first chart in the series, he leads with the statement, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." It's a phrase he uses again in a book that brought him global fame in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk. One of the most powerful examples of data visualization was made 121 years ago by an all African American team led by W.E.B Du Bois, only 37 years after the end of slavery in the United States. The data visualizations in the exhibit are split into two sections: the Georgia Negro, which focuses on the typical state of Georgia, which had the second largest African American population. Virginia actually had the largest and the highest Negro to white ratio. The other section is called, quote, "A series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves now in residence in the United States of America." which focuses on the national and international view of the data. The exact sequence of how Du Bois made the charts is not entirely known, but the Library of Congress has the Georgia Negro as the first of the two. This is a sequence as defined potentially even by Daniel J. Murray himself when he entered them into the Library of Congress a few years after the exhibition, but we'll come back to this later. Let's start to dig into the work by looking at an international view of the data in Negro population of the United States compared with the total population of other countries. This map diagram shows us the comparison between a smaller 7.5 million populated all Negro America to 10 other countries, all drawn in proportion to their populations. Du Bois makes the comparison in terms of nationhood, clearly inferring the existence of an independent Black state that exists as an equivalent to the established European countries like Spain, England, and Hungary. You'll notice that this chart is in English and French so that the widest group of exposition guests can read the labels. Pivoting then from the international to the national, in the next chart, we see the next chart in the series. Du Bois visualizes Negro population growth as a small nation growing inside of the American silhouette. Du Bois elegantly crafts a complex argument. As the silhouette of the country grows, the Negro population also grows, not at a faster rate, but as a distinctly different entity. This is not a line chart or a bar chart to compare numbers. Du Bois again visualizes the data in terms of distinct nations. When viewed alongside the preceding image, showing a fully Negro populated United States in comparison to the European countries, Du Bois clearly implies the possibility of a separate Negro nation state. This chart, the literacy of the American Negro compared with that of other nations, is from the second series, and as you'll notice, the printed title at the top of the chart. If there was a breakout idea that challenged the status quo, it's this finding by Du Bois. One can almost hear the surprise when he writes, quote, Negro illiteracy is less than that of Russia and only equal to that of Hungary. While Negroes were synonymous with being uneducated, Du Bois shows that several European countries had a higher illiteracy rate. He's literally saying to the audience at the Paris Exposition, are we really so different than you are? The finality of the one-word title, illiteracy, speaks volumes in this chart. The period at the end of the title helps to underscore the severity of the statement. From the Georgia Negro series, the chart is an unusual plotting of time versus rate, with time on the vertical and bars extending from each axis to form a sort of lattice. Du Bois is only telling part of the larger story of this chart, as the white illiteracy rate in 1900 was only 6.2%. But Du Bois was not highlighting the racial disparity in this series. Instead, he was focusing on the decrease in illiteracy and overall progress in the African-American community. Here's an example of the updated chart by Dataviz superstar Mona Chalabi, where she updates the chart with the latest available data. I showed as a quick example of how the visualizations of the past can inspire the forms of data storytelling in the present. And here I want to put a quick shout out to the Du Bois Challenge, which we've seen all over social media. So thanks again, Alan and AJ, for organizing that. Income and expenditure of 150 Negro families in Atlanta, Georgia, USA is probably the most unique chart in the series. It's singular in its horizontal format and features a unique design within the exhibit. The chart acts as a sort of key to the entire series as it humanizes the data. The top row of the chart is like an expanded legend with rent, food, clothes, taxes, and other expenses also doubling as column headers that are mapped to the colors we see in the horizontally stacked bars below. The chart actually comes at the end of the Georgia Negro series. It was actually number 31 in the sequence, but was displayed as the introduction to the charts in the exhibit, as you can see here in the original photograph. In the inset image, you can actually see the coin and photos of the chart. Du Bois used this mixed media on this chart to connect the data to the rest of the exhibit, which relied heavily on images of prosperous, successful African Americans that challenged conventions. As my research intensified, so did my, excuse me. As my research intensified, so did my questions, and I found myself in contact with the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs divisions. After 6 weeks of correspondence, which is really a lie, after 6 weeks of begging and pleading with the librarians, I was permitted, quote, very special permission to view only one of the original charts in person. So it was a real thrill to see the handmade work and examine the actual pen marks I'd been studying for months already. As you can see, the charts are quite large at 27 by 22 inches, and that's this computer that I'm projecting from today right there next to it. This is also the only work in the series that features gold leaf and colored crayon, as well as the collage photographs. And it's also important, it's also an important chart, as I'll argue that Du Bois is actually among the very first designers to consider their visualizations to be interactive, as evident in the label "For further statistics, raise this frame." And this is a photograph that I took of that original work, that shows exactly how the chart was physically handled. And these marks suggest the indentation of the fingernails of the Paris Exposition guests. Exploring details like this could only be possible by viewing the original works, and it certainly helps to understand the context and creation of the work. Since the charts were made to be handled, they were sequenced to expose new layers of data in each subsequent chart. It's likely that a jump from one chart to another was synonymous in Du Bois' time to a double click in ours. Out of the 60 charts in the exhibit, I personally find this one to be the most compelling. Proportion of freedmen and slaves among the American Negroes. The label "slaves" arranged inside of the mountainous black area is still a kick in the gut. The green ribbon at the top of the chart shows the ratio of free to enslaved African Americans over roughly a century. There are many different ways Du Bois could have charted this data. By putting the focus on the freemen, both in the colored ribbon as well as by listing out the percents for each decade, it emphasizes their minority in comparison to the massive black area below. The story it tells is simple. For 76 years, no less than 86% of all African Americans in the United States were slaves. But the nuanced story remains on the right side of the chart. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1863, yet it takes an additional 7 years and a civil war for the remaining 6,675,000 slaves to gain their freedom. Here's a chart from the Georgia Negro series, and as you can see, it's made in much the same way as the chart that preceded it. This time we see the percentage of freed Negroes over the same 73-year period as a red area cascading down the right side of the chart, wavering between 0.7 and 1.7% until it reaches 100% at the bottom. Looking at the 1860 census to get some sense of scale, the total population of 1,057,000 people in Georgia, 462,000 were slaves. That's 44% of the entire population. As I said a second ago, the chart on the right is a sort of a rotated view of the chart on the left, sort of a double click. Du Bois was careful to keep similar types of data in their comparative modes while exploring each data set to highlight the story on each level of granularity. This chart, Occupations of Negroes and Whites in Georgia, is also from the Georgia Negro series. It presents a dazzling near symmetrical chart of Du Bois' own design, where two mirrored fan charts display corresponding categories, allowing the direct comparison across an event horizon that effectively delineates the color line. The legend applies equally to both groups, as the distribution of the occupations between the two groups are surprisingly similar. Negro farmers are only 2% lower than white farmers. Negroes had a considerably higher percentage of service occupations than whites, and whites have a considerably more industrial and mechanical jobs. But they're displayed here as comparable units within a circular whole. And I find this chart to be really quite effective still. While non-traditional even today, it is intuitive and with the right data could easily be used again. But with this chart, I also want to address what I think is a misconception. A number of articles have called out the striking design and limited primary colors of the charts to presage modernism. While the concept is very appealing, I do not believe this to be correct. As I mentioned earlier, Du Bois considered himself to be an academic, and he was deeply versed in the most contemporary methods of depicting data. Du Bois had studied many sociological texts, including the work of Henry Gannett, which he referenced in the Philadelphia Negro the year before. So it's obvious that Du Bois was familiar with Gannett's Statistical Atlas of the United States, featuring luxuriously illustrated maps and charts, as well as sociological data incorporated into his work. Considering Du Bois and team were under such strict time constraints, luxuries like printing were clearly out of the question. The resulting handmade works gained an artistic dimension that is missing from the more scientific work at the time. Each chart would need to be hand-painted watercolor on thick cardstock, and it's likely that Du Bois chose to use watercolors by George C. Osborne manufactured in Philadelphia. He likely chose basic primary colors for their ability to easily imprint on his scientifically minded European audience. He stripped away any decoration in order to make the charts more effective, and the precision of the charts conveyed scientific authenticity. While the works are remarkably beautiful, they were likely crafted for influence, not artistic merit. So if you excuse me, let's take more of a detour into art history. While precursors to modernism were present in the 19th century, the concept of modernism wasn't established until the other isms like surrealism, had crystallized around Europe in the first years of the 20th. This took time, and most of the modernists were simply too young to have been directly inspired by the works of the exposition. Picasso was only 19 years old and traveled from Spain to Paris in the fall. Walter Gropius, who started the Bauhaus, was only 17. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was only 5. Piet Mondrian was 28, but living in the Netherlands. Kandinsky was 28, but had just created a career in law in Russia to attend an art school in Munich. The fusion of science and art that fueled modernism in general, and in specific, the Bauhaus and Vienna Circle, were certainly in a similar space that Du Bois was operating into 2 decades earlier, but as a sociologist. One can only imagine what might have happened if he and his team had found the right support at the Paris Exposition. Had the impact of the exhibit of American Negroes been an international touchstone, Du Bois might have continued to create statistical charts, and the line between this work and what was to come in art and design might have been possible. This is the most recognized chart by Du Bois, City and Rural Population, 1890. It exemplifies the creativity that Du Bois employed in creating his work, and in some ways it cements his place in history as a data viz innovator. It's an unusual chart that we now call a Du Bois spiral, and while it is obscure, it actually does a very good job at showing massively disproportionate comparisons. The chart tells a story of just how many African Americans lived in rural Georgia, that in the smaller or larger cities, the large red spiral immediately leaves an impression, a visual beacon that draws the eye in a way that few charts could. The innovation that Du Bois made was built on precedent, as it was common at the time to simply bend a very long bar chart to a sort of snake if it didn't fit the allocated space, as we can see in these 2 other charts from the same series. Another way of looking at the Du Bois spiral is to envision it as a horizontally stacked bar chart on an extremely long scale. Breaking the stacked bar into a series of angles highlights the disparities in the data, and the resulting massive red spiral is a great way to focus on the main insight. Of course, as my illustration on the bottom right shows, it could have also been done as an ordinary bar chart. But if it were, I doubt we'd be speaking about it 121 years later. This brings up an important idea that's very easy to gloss over, but it's important to remember that Du Bois was trying to impress his audience. He was trying to show off, and while many of the charts are traditional in their design, he knew that these unusual forms would create more interest. Not all charts are created equal, and 22 charts in the exhibit are fairly conventional bar charts. Our visual literacy allows us to quickly read traditional chart types, but at the same time, it also makes them easier to forget. The role of novelty in our chart making should not be devalued, nor even dismissed as chart junk, but rather used to focus our audience's attention on what matters. Clearly, this form resonated with audiences and has been proven to be historically important as the result of its novelty. Like I said earlier, I'm very interested in the sequence of the charts of the exhibition. I feel that learning more about the sequence could help us to understand how they were made and how they were meant to be viewed. As my research intensified, I compiled a list of the charts in sequential order as provided by the Library of Congress, then returned to the exhibition photo itself to look for more clues. What I found was shocking. I love that cliffhanger of an ending. He says while drinking a glass of water. On the upper right-hand side of the image is a chart that I could not identify and was not in the collection of the Library of Congress. I triple checked the inventory and there was one chart that was similar, but it was not the same. I quickly started to play around with the image in Photoshop and found the highest resolution image I could, but I could already see that it was indeed a unique new piece that had not been studied before. So like anybody working in research, I then went again and pleaded with librarians for help. Luckily, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst had the original image and sent over a high resolution version, and the decrease of illiteracy among the Black freedmen of the United States. This previously unknown work was hidden in plain sight. The quality of the image is high enough to decipher the text. This chart shows the 36% drop in illiteracy of freedmen over a 30-year period. And as you can see, I was also able to recolor the work based on the corresponding gray scales in the image. There are only a few options available from the limited palette to choose from. So I believe that this green and black color have a clear correlation with some of the charts that we've seen earlier in the lecture. And I believe the newly discovered chart is actually a missing link between the three views of data for both illiteracy and the proportion of freedmen. This work creates a correlation between freedom and education and shows just how systematic Du Bois was in crafting his message and reinforcing it throughout the entire series. There are 63 of Du Bois's charts in the exhibit of American Negroes in the collection of the Library of Congress. By identifying 64th, it opens up some additional ambiguity. As mentioned, some of the works in the second series have printed titles, which could mean that they were actually created first, as it would have taken longer to get the titles printed. But the charts in the second series with green outlines were actually hand lettered. So it could be that they were actually created at the end of the project. And if you think about it, that actually makes sense. As the research and data collection for the Georgia Negro series was being conducted, some of Du Bois' students were already drafting the initial charts. It's very likely that the team uncovered additional insights as they worked. And since Du Bois was committed to his structured argument, they would naturally find interesting additional visual methods for telling a compelling story. And it's important to consider just how surprising this exhibition would have been, as African Americans were held in low esteem across the white world in 1900. While certainly free of the hostilities of white Americans, this exhibition was intended to curry favor with Europeans, many of which still harbored significant prejudice. Du Bois and team took great care in considering how their exhibit would be perceived. So it also makes sense that such a strong visual would take an important place in the exhibit itself, above the crowds and in the line of sight from outside the exhibit. Certainly, the story of the great improvement in illiteracy would have been more palatable than the story of slavery itself. Because the exhibit was not a success at its time, Du Bois took an abrupt turn away from the social sciences, and in 1903, he published the work that would bring his ideas to a global audience. The Souls of Black Folks is a remarkable book that pairs elements of his ethnographic research with African-American poetry and spiritual songs. In this book, his anger boils through, and his rage is paired with his brilliance, and his passionate voice quickly became recognized as a leader in the struggle for African-American rights. So it's interesting to think about this quote written in his biography at age 90 on his early years in social science. Where had I failed? There were many answers, but one was typically American, as the event proved. I did the deed, but I did not advertise it. In the long run, advertising without the deed was the only lasting value. Perhaps Americans do not realize how completely they had adopted this philosophy, but Madison Avenue does. The story of the exhibit of American Negroes is so compelling because it's the story of a missed opportunity. It is ultimately a brilliant tragedy for the small nation of people that Du Bois and his expanded team tried so hard to present to an indifferent white audience. As viewers of this work in the present, we're all too aware of the inequalities that followed after the exhibit. We can point to these superior design and brilliant minds with the knowledge that their cause was not recognized until the Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination based on color, race, gender, or national origin 64 years later. Knowing that a pivotal moment like this existed with such incredible opportunity for change all the way back in 1900 gives additional perspective to the Black Lives Matter movement today, now 121 years later. While I'm thrilled to be discussing this today, and truly I am, the fact is that this work is still underexplored and is yet to be embraced by mainstream academics. Du Bois' abrupt turn away from the social sciences certainly necessitates the study of his career and impact on his later life. Yet at the same time, his role in the social sciences remains less known. The charts in the exhibit were only digitized in 2013, and any previous study was done on the black and white microfilm versions available that you can see in the lower left corner. There are a few rich sources of information, many by Du Bois himself, such as the full recounting of the exhibit and the review of reviews, as well as the recently published book on the subject. But the fact remains that more research is waiting to be done, not only on the context of the exhibit, but on the historic data itself as compiled by Du Bois and his team. This is a rich source of information just waiting to be explored. And with every book, article, and social media post and lecture, the story of the exhibit of American Negroes continues to spread Du Bois' daring vision. As I've gotten involved in researching and writing about these works, I've found that there are more voices from the past that have just not been explored. I continuously find amazing stories about innovative but overlooked dataviz practitioners from the past, and more surface every day. Over and over again, I find graphic forms from the past can inspire us to create new ways of communicating or visualizing ideas today. This research has changed me as a person and as a practitioner. So I want to end this talk today by asking you out there, what other stories are out there to be found and retold? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason. That was definitely very powerful. There's been a lot of comments coming through the chat window, how amazing this is, how powerful this is. I think a lot of that just speaks to Du Bois, his use of storytelling in addition to data visualization. He didn't just put a bunch of charts up there. He was very strategic about how he laid everything out, use of color in the fonts. One question that I have that's coming from the Q&A is, you got comments. This was a great presentation. They loved your 7-part series. Could you speak to why we haven't heard about Du Bois' work from, say, Edward Tufte? Like, I think you touched on it a little bit in your presentation, but can you speak a little bit more as to why maybe this work hasn't gotten the exposure that it should have had, especially in data visualization circles?
Thanks for asking. So the first reason is that it's just deeply obscure, right? It was only digitized in color in 2013. And so, I think one of the interesting things about meeting and getting to know librarians a little bit more is that one of the main problems with library science and libraries, and even for that matter, archives in general, is knowing what's even in the archive. So this was deeply obscure work. It was only digitized fairly recently. The other catch is that this work actually played a fairly small but important role in Du Bois's career, right? I believe quite fervently that as a result of coming up with something that was so fantastic, but just didn't find its audience, that's what helped him to pivot into really embracing his passions with his brilliance, which allowed people to connect with his ideas a little bit more. The third thing I'll say is I emphasize with extra mocking irony the chart junk comment. Du Bois, Tufte has not recognized this in any form that I have seen. I do believe that most of the data viz history books that are being taught today, and in fact a lot of the classes, do recognize this work. So I'm very pleased that myself, along with you, Alan and AJ, have really had some impact on bringing this to the forefront.
Yeah, I think we have time for another question. So can you speak more about how your relationship to this, to the sequence has changed you? Like, where is it taking you next? And I just want to piggyback one more thing on there. What was the thing that most surprised you during the research?
Oh gosh, two great questions. Thanks so much for asking. So I'm going to do the second one first. What surprised me so much is how little I knew about African American history. I was a very unpromising suburban high school student, and I literally didn't know most of the stories that I uncovered in the data. Now, certainly that could be on my, as already stated, lack of academic prowess. But I think it really just means that we're not really talking about the story of African Americans in America still today. I feel like there's a continuous discussion about America owning its history versus how we want to kind of sweep it under the carpet. And I really have been very surprised at how much I learned in the process of the data discovery. The second part is how important history has become to my life, right? Like, there's the phrase, if you've done it in the past, you didn't repeat it. And that's totally true, but I would actually flip it around by saying, if you know the past, then you are inspired to leverage it, right? To use it to create positive change. And so that's what I really try to do, is focus on finding different aspects of data visualization that can inspire me and the teams that I work with to create new forms. And again, to help tell more stories of people that have just been under-recognized.
Sure. I think we have time for one more. So I guess maybe we can just walk through or summarize real quickly the ways that you felt that Du Bois was able to confront the negative stereotypes that were at the time around African Americans through his visualizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's one of the interesting things about really getting into the data and exploring the context around. I've really done a deep dive on about half of the charts in the exhibition. And what's been really fascinating is that they continuously focused on progress for African Americans, right? They could have very easily focused on the prejudice and the erosion of civil rights, but they didn't, right? And that's the thing that's been so fascinating, is because instead of trying to bring people down or something, they were like, hey, look, this is a group of people on the rise, right? And that's what this big presentation was to this European audience. And it's really important to keep in mind that it was a presentation for influence for a specific audience. It wasn't necessarily like just a broad report that was just kind of thrown out there. The other thing about it, which is also so interesting, is that Du Bois was an expert in collecting the data, right? He actually went through, knew a lot of the statistical census data that was available, had gone through and collected lots of pools of data across the South and US. But in addition to that, he also really created and innovated on crafting surveys that were hand issued or given interviews in an interview format to people around the Southeast. So as an interesting small anecdote, if you'll indulge me, we've recently found that one of the successful Black businessmen that is featured in Du Bois' work actually had his own collection at a archive in Kentucky, and there was actually not a link about any of the aspects or attributes of this gentleman's life. Well, it turns out that this fellow had filled out one of these surveys and actually had it as a part of Du Bois's research. So just by bringing this content up, we've been able to start to piece together some of these important but still missing aspects of African American data collection and really of telling and allowing their stories to be told still. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap up with you, Jason. Thank you again for the great presentation. Again, just to make a note that Du Bois did hand draw all of these. This was pre Tableau. So we're going to move now over to Anthony. Just 1 second.
Hello, everyone.
But I wanted to intro you first, Anthony. Sorry.
Sorry.
No worries. So yeah, Anthony's excited to get started. He's a developer designer who likes to combine art and code. Not only has he recreated all of the Du Bois 1900 visualizations, he's begun modernizing some of them with current data. So I'm very excited about his talk. He's going to be talking about his journey in recreating these visualizations and hopefully give us some pointers for how we would like to do the same, because I've been seeing some questions coming across the chat as well. Can some of these be recreated? So Anthony is definitely going to answer a lot of those questions. So take it away, Anthony.
Thank you. Let's see. Someone else is still sharing, I think, Jason? Perfect. Hi, everybody. I'm Anthony Starks, and I'm delighted to tell you about recreating the Du Bois Data Portraits. Our story begins in 1900, as Jason has talked about, where Du Bois wanted to show the progress of African Americans since emancipation. And he worked with students that look like this at Atlanta University. Here's the debating team and a set of stylish ladies sitting on the steps of the building of Atlanta University. This is Du Bois the dapper Du Bois in 1900. He had come over in steerage, and here he is at age 32, looking to change history, looking to tell the world what African Americans had done. This is a picture of the Exposition of the American Negro in 1900 that Jason has shown. But I want to give you a little bit of a context of what was going on around this time. Jason talked about things like human zoos, but during the summer of 1985 in a Brooklyn park, there was a cotton plantation complete with 500 workers reenacting slavery for the benefit of the audience. This show was called Black America. In 1899, 27 Georgians were lynched. Between 1890 and 1900, Georgia averaged more than one mob killing per month. For many people, Black lives did not matter. And there were three actual messages when I look at what he was trying to do. He wanted to say, we're here. This is who we are. We are in America. We are a vibrant population and we're everywhere. Secondly, this is who we are. This is the land that we own. These are the things that we have. These are our occupations. And finally, this is how far we have come, 35 years after the end of the Civil War. Jason showed this picture, and I want to show it as well. This is the picture of the exposition. But I like to paste in some of my recreations to get sort of a view of what it was actually like. There's Jason's find right there. Okay, shout out to him for that one. But you can see the colors and the framed photographs and so forth. As was talked about before, this was meant to grab the eye and to show and to bring people in. I also like to think about scale here. Again, these were poster-sized things, and Jason showed how you can flip between them, approximately 22 by 28 inches. But as we're talking about it, I really wanted to study a taxonomy of this data. Over 50% of them are what we would call bar charts, about 16% maps, then what I call blocks, then there's the familiar circular ones, and then line graphs. Here are the bars all laid out, and you can see there's conventional ones that you've typically seen today. And there's this one, which is interesting, which sort of shows the shape of Georgia, which is Georgia data. But you'll see some innovative things. This is the woven pattern showing two variables. There's also the literacy chart that Jason showed. And then here you see an example of looping of the data even in the bar chart. There are lots of maps, few maps, again, 16% in the collection. The first one shows the African slave trade as we moved from Africa to North and South America. Lots of choropleth maps for the United States and the state of Georgia. And as Jason mentioned, showing the Black population in context with itself, as well as the rest of the world. The circular forms are ones that, again, are familiar to scholars looking at this data. There's the famous Du Bois spiral, city and rural population. But there's also the big blobs of data just showing Negro teachers in Georgia public schools. Again, think of walking through and seeing these. There's that, what I call target chart, talking about the value of taxable property, and the fan chart that we've been talking about before. This one, again, as Jason talked about, was sort of a section header. It shows things in French and English, as well as an embedded pie chart, which we would see today, as well as a choropleth chart. And then finally, the Du Bois pinwheel. The blocks are really interesting to me because, again, they show the bold use of colors and abstract shapes to get the message across. There's the black stain of slavery cut with the green of freedom. And again, there's Jason's, I recreated Jason's as well, Jason's find. There's only 3 line graphs in the whole collection, but some of these are interesting as well. If you look closely, the axes are switched. The dates are on the y-axis, not how we typically do it today. And also I like this one because the small, narrow aspect ratio emphasizes the progress, evaluation of city and town property. I think someone asked them the questions about the color palette. This is a color palette that I used during the recreation. And you can see there's the RGB values as well if you'd like to recreate them. The black, brown, and tan were used typically to denote racial characteristics. And then there's that use of red, green, and black. Someone asked, did this influence the Pan-African scheme? Perhaps. In my research, that scheme wasn't created until 1920. So maybe this influenced it as well. So again, this is a color palette. If you'd like to recreate them in your own, you can use these. For typography, it's interesting because they use both typeset characters as well as hand-drawn. And I use Public Sans to do that and Charter for the hand-drawn ones. But I'd like to point out a new typeface called William, obviously named after Du Bois, by a foundry called Vocal Type. And it was made directly to mimic the typography in these original visualizations. Let me tell you about my journey just a little bit. I first encountered this work in a New York data visualization meetup in May 2017. I was gobsmacked. I'm like, wait a minute, Du Bois, data visualization? These two things don't go together. And then when I saw things like the spirals and so forth, my first note was, I'd love to be able to recreate those. And spurred by Jason's research and the publication of this book, W.E.B Du Bois Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America by Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Brett Resser, was my reference. When you open the book, this is what you see. I spent many, many hours poring over this page and the pages within. As I was putting this together, I was really struck by the analog versus digital view on doing this. In 1900, they used pen and ink, watercolor and paper, and the expos to show the data. Today, we're using scripting and digital fonts and PDFs and the internet to show the data as well as Zoom calls like today. And I found I really had to go analog to really reproduce these well, using things like rulers and protractors to make sure that I got the angles and proportions just right. Oops. Just an aside, the tool that I use to do this is called DeckShell. DeckShell is a domain-specific language for doing presentations and information displays and so forth. I created this because I was not happy with some of the tools that were out there. In fact, this presentation you're seeing today was created in DeckShell, and it has structure and text and lists and images and so forth. One of its main focuses is placing things on a percent grid so that things can automatically scale. And it's a way to easily think about your designs. Here's kind of the workflow that I used. On the left, I have the code. In the middle is the output, in this case, PDF. And then for reference, the original plates from the Library of Congress. So it's easy that I've got it set up now where I can make a change. And as I save it, I can see the rendered data immediately. Jason talked about this one. This is, again, one of my favorites. It's one of the ones that's up on my wall as well. Talks about income and expenditure. And this is the one that I really thought about. How would this look with modern data? But this one is interesting because it shows both the data visualization, as Jason described, as well as a mixture of photographs as well. And just as an aside, if you go to the Library of Congress link, take a look at the photographs that go along with the exposition. They're exquisite and very interesting. But thinking about the design, it was useful to break it up into these kinds of sections. So the title was the first 5%, the next 10%, the categories, income on the left and charts on the right. Again, breaking it up into sections like that was useful in doing the recreations. This is just some statistics about the recreations. I created 57 plates of total lines of code, around 6,500, with an average of about 100 lines of code. There's a mixture of both machine generated, so I use computers to generate the code. That was useful for doing the maps, for example, but the great majority were hand coded with around 60 lines per code for each of those. For code management and automation, it was very, very useful to organize the collection. Each directory is laid out by plate number, and in each directory is a PDF rendition, a ping rendition, the original plate, and the script to actually build it. I think someone asked in the previous one, is the data available? Yes, in the repo where I could derive the data, there is, a data.csv there for you to reference. I use scripting to build each of the presentations, each of the visualizations. You can build them individually or you can build the whole thing. That's also useful if you're playing with fonts and that kind of thing, and just to make sure that you've got a consistent look. And I use Git and GitHub to manage the source code. Let's walk through some examples quickly. So this is one of the simpler ones where you've got the data on the left and the chart on the right. At the bottom, you'll see the DeckShell code where you've got deck and index, and then slide and then slide, and then all the information in between there. This one is very simple. It's basically 3 lines. You've got 3 lines that show the text, and you call the chart mechanism of dchart to lay it out. This one is interesting in that I use the deck shell variables to highlight some of the relationship between the objects. When you look at the objects, absent the text, there's only four things. There's two arcs and there's two lines. But then you lay them out from top to bottom across the page. It was useful to build some of the higher level things like the brace object as well, and that's built into deck shell. That was one of the things that going through this process allowed me to build some of the higher level things within the program. This one is interesting in that, again, it shows using the variables to talk about the relationships between the items and also the colors and so forth. Here you see, the 89% and the 11% for the left-hand bar and the right-hand bar. You put all of the relationships together, and then you simply render vertical lines. As I talked about before, I was very interested in applying these techniques to modern data. And I'm not alone in this. Some of the people at Princeton University, the Organization of Dignity and Debt, were starting to explore this again in 2019. And the Vizzy Lab at Princeton shows some examples of using what we call the Du Boisian style for showing student debt and racial disparities. Here's an example of the famous fan chart or wedge chart that shows the two populations and the occupations. On the left is the one from 1900. On the right is the one using it from 2019 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's very interesting to see, again, this chart form stands up even to modern data. Some of the categories change and so forth, of course, but you can also compare back and forth. Here's an example of doing it for the income and expenditure chart. Again, one of my favorites, with modern data. Again, this is the income of African Americans and whites and other races, and comparing how they spend their money. I've been working with social scientists as well, particularly Professor Charlie Eaton of UC Merced, who wants to apply this particular style in his work. This is, again, talking about for-profit colleges. And we're looking to use Stata and R kinds of templates to show that kind of data as well. As was mentioned before, all of the data that we talked about, that I've talked about before here, is in GitHub repos, github.com/AJ Starks/Du Data Portraits. That's the things that we've talked about before. And the modern ones are in Modern Du Bois Viz. I want to leave you with a challenge. A couple of weeks ago, Allen Hillery and C.Q. Tyler came to me and said, why don't we do a challenge of reproducing the Du Bois visualizations? And we'll do that on Twitter. Of course, I signed up for it and curated this list here, of which you've seen today. So we've got a good match of line graphs and bar graphs, the famous fan graph, the block one, the expenditure, the spirals, of course, as well as the maps. So the idea is to reproduce these, post them on Twitter, and there's been a lot of activity in this regard. So here's just posted some of the information, some of the examples. And again, the link at the bottom has a pointer to the rules of the road for this. That's my time. I'm Anthony Starks. This is how you can get a hold of me and you can look at the data and the work that I'm talking about. This particular presentation is on Speaker Deck, so you can download it today. You can look at the visualizations on Instagram. And if you download it, as a bonus, there's a catalog in the back of all of the presentations. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, that was yeah, and thank you for shouting out the Du Bois Challenge. So looking to see if we have any questions for you. I think one thing I want to make sure that everyone realizes is that the tools that you use to recreate were tools that you developed yourself, correct?
Correct.
And how long did it take you? Because I know you've also recreated all the 1900 visualizations. How long did that?
I started in July of 2019 and ended in October. So it took me a few months to do it.
Okay. Anything surprised you as you were doing it, or any insights that you gained from the experience?
Again, my insights was just really trying to think about the hands. As I was putting this together, I would just think about the hands that were actually doing it. And in many cases, it seemed like it was easier to do it in an analog fashion than to recreate them digitally. So again, some of the insights, again, as I talked about before, is those 3 points. We're here. This is who we are. And this is how far we've come. And using visuals to tell that story is just very compelling.
All right, so I see some additional questions coming through. So,
Sure.
So one that we got from Pearl Lundeen, what are your thoughts on the reproduction of the original visualizations and what it does to the original story?
I think it preserves the original story. So one of my principles was to try to be as close as possible to the originals. I mean, I took a couple of liberties. So for example, a lot of times when people reproduce these, they use sort of this linen colored background. I just used a white background because I assumed the originals were white and they just faded with age. And as you can see behind me, they make great posters. So it's
yeah, you got voted best Zoom background for the presentation. So congrats.
Perfect. So as you can see, there's a few things there. There's the book there. There's the poster as well. So my appreciation with these is not just as a storytelling thing, but also as art pieces. As I mentioned before, I gave these as gifts to my children for Christmas, so they can have a little bit of the heritage in their own homes.
Sure. So we are getting some more questions about the deck. I don't know how to put
deck shell.
Deck shell. So some of the questions are: is it open source?
It absolutely is open source. It's written in the Go programming language. It's also cross-platform. It works on Mac, Linux, and PCs. If you look at my GitHub, you'll see examples. You'll see the data. You'll see the code there. I also have binaries that you can download and use.
And
so
another question,
guys.
Yeah, another question around the deck shell is like, why did you? I guess the actual question is how did you choose deck shell? And like, well, I guess what brought you to? I guess part of that question is like, what led you to feel the need to have to create something of your own to kind of do the visualizations?
First of all, I use things like PowerPoint and those kinds of things, and they all have a sort of typical way of working in that you're pushing pixels around and so forth. But, I'm a developer, I'm a programmer, and in many ways, it's more useful and easier to think in terms of the numbers and the relationship between the items. And I was just more productive working this way. I found, that I was working in a certain way, let's say in a traditional presentation program. And I said, you know what, I can do this in a better way. And it was, I'm not saying it works for everyone, but it does work for me because I can program things. I can make the program do things that would be laborious for me in other ways. And I found it just sort of breaks some of the conventions that you have. The tools, if you will, tend to color the kinds of works that you do. And I just find that this works well for me.
That's fair. And so we have another
And the
question.
other reason is I'm a programmer, so I can.
There you have it.
But why not?
Why not? So another question is about, so this one is around like, I guess bringing the visualizations to quote unquote modern times. So Jennifer Reyes, she was commenting on the income chart that you presented
Sure.
and how it used the comparison groups is to whites and other groups. So I guess her question is, in recreating that with current data, would you still, what demographic groups would you use, or how would you, I guess, lay it out or present it?
Let me go back to that one to talk about it. Okay. So again, I used just standard government data for this. And this one is actually it doesn't really follow the original. So the original took Black families across socioeconomic areas. So they have it from poor, fair, comfortable, and well-to-do. I didn't have that data at the time, and I would love to get my hands on that data broken down that way to be able to do that. So this is very much a work in progress, but the data I was able to get easily was this one, just comparing African Americans and whites and other races for showing how they spend their money.
Yeah. So another question we have here is from Chad Bennett. So he doesn't want, and you may have brought this up, I don't remember either, but when thinking about the color palettes for demographic categories, I guess the question that he's asking is to make sure when you are doing it, it's both consciously inclusive and non-controversial. Do you have any feedback or direction around that?
Again, I think it's good to think in those terms. Let's go to the color palette if I can find it. And again, I use this palette because that was the palette in the originals. If you're going to do these with modern times, I probably wouldn't replicate that, given it's kind of fraught, if you will. But this was the palette that they used to make their particular examples. So one of them, let's see if I can find it quickly. This one. This is interesting because they use, it's titled Amalgamation of White and Black Elements of the Population. And they're using, quote, skin tones for Negroes, if you will, ranging from black to the yellow, okay? I would never do that today. But again, in this case, I was being faithful to the originals.
Oh, this is a good one. So you're being asked, what is your favorite visualization and why?
Okay, again, behind me, that's probably my favorite one. Because, the colors and because of the message that it shows. Let me see if I can find it quickly in the catalog. I can talk about it. I can use that one. Okay. So it as Jason mentioned, there's that implicit color line right there in the center. And it shows you and it allows you in a very easy way to show the distinctions between the two populations. So for example, agricultural fisheries and mining, 69% versus 64%. Pretty much the same. But the other one that stood out to me is domestic and personal service, 28% versus 5.5%. And that really speaks to the occupations at the time. Other things like manufacturing and mechanical industries, what we might call technology today, 12% versus 5%. These disparities are even affecting us today. But I think this one really, in a very bold way, shows that story. This is one of my favorites. I also like Jason's favorite as well, but this is the one that, again, you'll see I've used it in many examples. This is the one that really stood out to me.
I think that's the one that we should bring back. I think that should be the revival chart type.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there's definitely some tutorial videos out about this one. So
Right. I think someone asked in the previous question, can this be done in Tableau? I think the answer is yes. And I believe somebody's done it already in the Du Bois Challenge. Is that correct, Alan?
yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
Luke Stanky, he's done some videos around it. I don't have his Twitter handle offhand, but yeah, there's definitely some videos out about this one and some of the other ones that are called spiral graphs.
Yeah.
YouTube experts can correct me, but I'm calling them spiral graphs right now. So we have some time and a few more questions out here.
Sure.
So I guess there's one here about, designing for color blindness. I mean, that's something that's more on topic now, maybe versus 121 years ago.
Right.
So what would be your recommendations on anyone who wants to recreate and wanted to take color blindness into and other usability topics?
Correct. I would definitely embrace that. And again, the use of contrast is also very important. So it would be interesting to compare this particular palette to see how colorblind safe it is. So yes, that is definitely a consideration. That was one that Charlie Eaton had done some of the recreations in Stata and R, and that was brought up as well. So yes, that's certainly something that we should consider.
Can I add two cents?
Sure.
I feel like this is a totally accessible color palette.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I don't see anything that looks like it's going to be shocking about this. Red and green are colors. They exist for most of us, and there are ways around just changing the colors for everything, like labeling, which we would want to do anyways, right? So even if you have something that's going to even be, like a stoplight, if you label it and work with your audience to make sure they understand it, should be okay. I think that adding things like alt text to our charts is probably another consideration, but I don't think that that's going to have a huge relevance in this particular work in Du Bois.
Yeah. And one of the things that, again, was interesting, as you mentioned, that is the use of annotations. He makes very good use of annotations throughout the collection. And again, there was the additional consideration of some of them had to be in English and French.
Okay. Oh, this is a good one. I think I can open this up to both of you. So based on your experience with his work, how can we continue Du Bois' legacy as a data analyst?
Again, one of the things that I'm working with in the academic community is to create a website of resources for doing this, targeting especially the social sciences. And that includes doing tools. I don't expect anybody else to do this in Excel. But things like R and Stata, and we're starting to build those resources together And we're creating a website in order to do that. So if anybody wants to help with that, please get a hold of me, let me know. That work is just beginning. Again, I'm working with the folks at Princeton and UC Merced. So again, when I think about sort of the spirit of all of this, as Jason said, know your audience and be bold. You know, these are bold things, right? And don't be afraid of invention, and don't be afraid of breaking convention, right? Some of these things, I mean, had not been seen before, if you will, you know, or they popularized the spiral and so forth. So, you know, embrace those things. Go back to the past to see what has worked, and be bold and know your audience, and work it that way. That would be sort of my general advice.
My 2 cents is one of the things that I've really taken explicitly from this work into my own practice is the idea of going from a very high level concept or aggregation of data to a very specific instance of the data. So that could be if you have a survey just also populating a few quotes, if there's an open text area. That could also be, and just understanding how the layers of your data kind of connect you or a person on the ground with some kind of larger global trend or something like that. And I also want to stack hands on Anthony's concept about being bold. You know, this is a great time to kick down barriers and make big gestures in data. You know, you can even do that on dashboards, right?
Correct.
So there's another question that we have coming that came through. So as we know, or as most of us may know, when Du Bois was, you know, creating this exhibit, there was a lot of talks of social Darwinism in his circles. So one of the questions that came up was, how much impact do you feel did the work being done by the American Eugenics Society have on the work of Du Bois?
I can't speak to that directly, but I will speak to one aspect that they were pushing against, this whole notion of what we call today scientific racism, sort of trying to prove that a particular population via science was inferior. This whole work is trying to refute that. So I think that was, again, talking about the, you know, the human zoos and the lynchings and so forth. That's important, but use social science to combat fake science. So that's important.
Did you have anything around that, Jason? Or
Yeah, I think that the actual American eugenics, I don't know that much about this particular group. Eugenics was definitely a subject that had been around for a while. I think it was actually popularized more in this American Eugenics Society directly afterwards. And do keep in mind that the erosion of African American civil liberties really happened after 1900. We saw an erosion before, but really the real injustices were yet to come after this. So I think that might have been slightly later, but happy to dig in more and learn more.
sure. So this is another, I don't know how lighthearted this one is, but it's more of a data viz question. The question that's come out is, how do you think Stephen Few, you know, lover of all pie charts, would react to some of the visualizations that are here? Especially the one that we were talking about with the pie chart, actually.
This one?
Yeah.
The fan chart or the wedge chart?
The one below it is actually the one that probably would have given him conniptions.
Yeah. This one?
Yeah, that one.
Or this one. I love that one. I do. I love that one
too. It's not a great chart. It's really not a great chart. And do you have that one to pull up?
I do. Hang on.
Okay. Because what's actually interesting there As it's actually, again, I think it's very graphically beautiful, but really challenging as a work of data visualization. So one of the things that's funny about the colors while we're going through it. Oh yeah.
Hang on, I'll get to the catalog.
Oh, there we go. Oh, one of the things about the colors, which is actually something that we have not researched that I know of, is the fact that I think that a lot of these colors have actually faded. Yeah. And so in this chart, this actually, if I can annotate it here, this white color is actually not actually white.
Yeah.
And I do think that that was another color that faded. And also it's by area. So all of the challenges that you have with people complaining about pie charts and area and circular areas, you have magnified on this, where the area of from the center out to the radius is actually what this data is reflecting, and it's maybe not the world's greatest or easiest to understand chart. So I don't know. That's my 2 cents. Maybe you have a different pick.
Again, I just love the notion of these numbers just sort of stabbing into the middle. It's just compelling to me in some way.
But what's great about this one is you can see this willingness to experiment.
Exactly.
Right? Because again, this is probably much better served as a bar chart kind of going up and to the right, because technically the biggest number on this is the red, which actually has the smallest footprint visually, right? So it's an interesting point to think about the fact that they were trying to get people's attention. And I think they were able to get people's attention with this chart, maybe not to then map it back to the actual data they were trying to make in the argument, but that's just my opinion.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I know we're having a lot of fun, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. So I'm getting the signal. I just want to thank everyone again for coming. I mean, I think this was a really great talk. So definitely we hope you were able to take away something about Du Bois's life, his journey, of creating these visualizations, maybe to inspire your own path. Thank you so much again, Jason and Anthony, for your time and expertise. So that's some housekeeping stuff. So if you'd like to get more involved in doing this yourself, definitely check out Anthony's work. Make sure to follow Du Bois Challenge on Twitter. Some other things that I just wanted to talk about. So if you haven't checked out Tableau's new community hub, please check that out. It's giving much more centralized information about different programs, members, and events that are happening across the Tableau community. And definitely let us know if you'd like to be more involved, with the whole data and diversity series. I think there's a link that came out in the chat or will be coming out. So as we wrap up, I just want to let you know that definitely enjoy the rest of your day or your evening, depending where you're at. Thank you again for joining us. And we definitely hope that we see you at the next Data and Diversity event.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Fun.